Hello and welcome to the Record of Arms. I'm your host Mark 7. I'm going to start a new series today as well as a new format. I've been thinking that the long-form podcast format isn't exactly ideal for YouTube. So, for the channel I'll be releasing the same content as the podcast but in the form of more and shorter episodes. These will be about 3,000 words or about probably 15 or 20 minutes long, so I'll be putting out 2 or 3 videos per podcast episode. It seems to me that this might be better suited to the platform, and it will allow me to release content on here somewhat more regularly. I'll be keeping the long form for the podcast episodes, so I'll probably keep making and posting the long form videos from the podcast audio as well, so that anyone who prefers them in that format can still find them here. Let me know what you think about that, and any other ways that you think I could improve the show, maybe in the comments of the videos, or you can also find me on Twitter where I'm at Record of Arms. So we'll see how this goes. This new series will be another one devoted to an examination of the development of a career of a combat aircraft. This one will focus on the Brewster Buffalo, designated the F-2A in U.S. Navy and Marine service. This was a suggestion I got from a viewer that I thought was a great idea. To go along with the new format, I'm also going to be reducing the intros and outros of the videos, and for anyone interested in my sources, I'll leave them in the description box. So, with all that being out of the way, let's start the new series. The F-2A program was part of the process of the development of Navy air power in the 20 years following the end of World War I. To put the aircraft in its proper context, therefore, we'll start by taking a quick look at American shipboard aviation in the interwar decades. The first American aircraft carrier was the USS Langley, CV-1. The ship was converted from the collier USS Jupiter. This ship was chosen for conversion due to its relatively high speed and its suitable size, as well as for certain convenient aspects of its design, such as its unusually tall cargo holds and wide hatches. The coal handling gear was removed, and the holds and coal bunkers converted into hangar spaces and aviation fuel storage. An unobstructed wooden flight deck was constructed atop the hull. The conversion was finished in 1922, and the first takeoffs and landings from an American carrier took place on her flight deck in October of that year. Concurrent work was being done on aircraft catapults for use aboard ships, and the first installation and launch of an aircraft from an operational warship's catapult also happened this year, from the deck of the battleship USS Maryland. The Langley was used mostly for experimental work in the first few years after conversion, and the first carrier fighter squadrons did not become operational aboard her until 1927. These were formed from units that had been established years earlier to operate catapult-launched aircraft and seaplanes. These were designated VF-1 and VF-2, according to the Navy scheme by which V indicated a heavier-than-air aircraft and F indicated fighting. The names, therefore, properly read as Heavier-Than-Air Fighting Squadrons 1 and 2, almost always shortened to Fighting 1 and Fighting 2. The meaning of the V here is the same when used in the Navy's letter code for aircraft carriers, which is CV, which properly read as Heavier-Than-Air Aviation Cruiser. They were initially equipped with the Vought VE-7, commonly known as the Bluebird. This was not a purpose-built fighter aircraft. Instead, this biplane was built as an advanced trainer, and was also used by the Army in this capacity at the time. The Bluebird had exceptional performance for a trainer, and the fighter version was modified into a one-seater by having the forward cockpit faired over, and a .30 caliber Vickers machine gun mounted on the top of the fuselage, synchronized to fire through the propeller disc. It used a 180 horsepower Wright Hispano E3 V8 engine, which gave it a top speed of 106 miles per hour, or 171 kph, and a range of about 250 nautical miles, or about 460 kilometers. Vought built most of the 128 Bluebirds that were produced, but some were made at the Navy's own manufacturing facility, the Naval Aircraft Factory at the Philadelphia Naval Yard. This was very common practice in the interwar decades, and factory personnel and their counterparts in private industry often worked hand in hand to perform developmental work at this facility, often assisted by engineers and technicians from the NACA, or the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, a government research agency and the predecessor of NASA. Landplane and floatplane variants of the VE-7 were produced. The latter often used as catapult planes aboard ships of the battle fleet. It was one of these that was used in the pioneering 1922 catapult launch from the Maryland. The first Navy plane designed from the beginning as a fighter was also produced at the Naval Aircraft Factory. This was known as the TS, or sometimes the TS-1. This was another single-seater biplane, with the fuselage suspended between the wings by a system of double cabane struts. It used a 200 horsepower air-cooled radial engine and was considerably faster than the Vought, which it served alongside. The first of these arrived aboard the Langley in 1922. The TS was also more heavily armed, with a pair of .30 caliber Brownings. Like the Vought, it was also produced in a floatplane form that was suitable for use from catapults from surface warships. 46 TS series fighters were built, some of them by Curtiss. These included experimental models for testing inline engine installations and an all-metal version, which appeared in 1924, and was designated the F-4C. VE-7s and TS series fighters would serve the Navy until 1927. As was the case with the procurement of most types of military aircraft in the interwar decades, the purchase of new types of Navy and Marine fighters was strictly limited by the available funding. As a result, what fighters were purchased were acquired in small batches, the result of small orders necessitated by the lack of funding. A variety of Navy fighters thus appear in the years between the mid-1920s and the mid-1930s. This variety was further increased by the desire to spread the limited orders between the major aircraft manufacturers in order to keep these struggling companies in business. A similar situation existed in the Army Air Service, or later the Army Air Corps, around the same time. It should be remembered that in the absence of military orders, little market existed for aircraft in the 1920s and into the 1930s, despite this period being commonly remembered as the golden age of aviation. The infrastructure of commercial aviation barely existed in the 1920s. Not only were such facilities as radio navigation beacons, reliable weather reporting, and 1,000 other prerequisites of safe and predictable airline traffic yet to be constructed, but very few communities had airports of any kind, much less those with the long concrete runways needed to operate large, multi-engine land planes. It was partly for this reason that most of the development of large aircraft, especially of large commercial aircraft during this time, concerned flying boats, for which the lack of airport facilities was no concern. The lack of a peacetime market made the survival of these aircraft manufacturers, and the advancement of their techniques and the skills of their workers, a matter of government concern, as the military security of the United States required that the capacity to build and equip a modern, first-class air force be maintained regardless of economic considerations. This necessity laid the basis for the close cooperation of these defense contractors with the Army and the Navy, and the coordination of their policies. The U.S. Navy carrier force in 1934 consisted of 3 ships, the Langley, the Lexington, and the Saratoga, with a 4th, the Ranger, commissioned in June. Of the original 2 fighter squadrons, one, VF-1, had transitioned away from the fighter role and flew dive bombers in 1934. We have already encountered this unit, under the designation VB-4, in a previous series, flying dive bombers from the decks of the Ranger during the Allied invasion of North Africa. VF-2, in 1934 called VF-6B, continued to fly as a fighter squadron, using Boeing fighters of the F-2B and F-3B types. After the end of the year, they would transition to the new Grumman F-2F. In terms of doctrine, the carriers were used in the auxiliary role which had evolved in the First World War and the years immediately afterwards. Carrier planes were intended to perform specific tasks in preparation for the main battle, which would come in the form of a clash of surface forces. Planes from the flat tops were used to scout out the enemy fleet's location and dispositions, while the dive bombers and torpedo planes would fly strikes to soften up the enemy battle line before the decisive surface action. Carrier fighters were tasked with fleet defense and the escort of friendly strike planes. The idea of the carrier airstrike as the major weapon against the enemy fleet was not yet plausible. The capabilities of strike aircraft against ships in these years, especially those small enough to operate from a carrier deck, were not yet sufficient to do more than harass an enemy battle fleet, and the heavy guns of the capital ships were still considered the ultimate weapons at sea. Money for the development of a powerful naval air force was also short in the years before the mid-1930s. The military in general operated on very modest congressional appropriations during most of the 2 decades following the end of the Great War. Comparatively expensive weapon systems, such as carrier aircraft, were procured only in small numbers. Development of the planes themselves, their power plants, as well as the many ancillary items and component systems necessary for their efficient operation in combat was also slow in the face of the lack of resources. This situation would change only slowly and mainly after 1935, as the threat of war in Europe and in the Far East became more credible. Throughout the 1920s and the first few years of the 1930s, The Navy flew biplanes with capabilities only incrementally greater than those used during the First World War, and they ordered them in small batches. Like most contemporary aircraft, planes used by the Navy and the Marines during this period transitioned from the use of liquid-cooled inline engines to air-cooled radials. Radials were simpler and lighter, giving them a higher power-to-weight ratio, and the lack of a cooling system meant that there was one less item to malfunction or to become inoperative due to battle damage. Radials also had another advantage that was important to a shipboard aircraft. They were more compact, meaning that a plane equipped with one could have a shorter fuselage, vital consideration when they would have to be stored in the limited spaces of hangar decks. The major drawbacks of the radial were the wide, flat nose surface they presented to the airstream, and the fact that only so many cylinders could be spaced around the engine's circumference. This limited one-row radials to 9 cylinders in most cases. Adding additional cylinders to increase power meant putting a second row behind the first, which created difficult cooling problems, as the rear cylinders would be sheltered from the airstream by the hot front row. The combination of the higher drag and the limit on horsepower of early radials made liquid-cooled engines the better choice for high-performance aircraft. The cooling problem was eventually solved, and once 2-row radial engines became practical, the power-to-weight advantage they offered made them the better choice. The drag problem presented by the blunt noses of such planes was compensated for by the increased power, and cowlings were developed that could greatly reduce the drag problem. Navy torpedo units in the early 20s flew large biplanes, either derivatives of the twin-engine NBS-1 Martin bomber used by the Army, or big single-engine biplanes such as the Douglas DT or the Curtiss CS. The earliest of these entered service not long before the conversion of the Langley, and some operated from the carrier, but not on a regular basis. These torpedo bombers were too large for regular operation from the relatively small Langley. Most of the early torpedo planes were built as float planes, and they were based on Navy seaplane tenders, while some were given wheeled undercarriages and operated from land bases. It was only with the commissioning of the next American carrier, the much larger USS Lexington, in 1928, that squadrons of torpedo bombers flew from American carrier decks as part of a regular air group. At this time, the Navy used the Martin T-3M, a 3-man aircraft powered by a 770 horsepower Packard V12 engine, and with a top speed of about 110 miles per hour, or 175 kph. This aircraft was replaced by the T-4M, an improved model which used a Pratt & Whitney radial and had slightly better performance. The T-4M began to enter squadron service in 1928. Some of these torpedo bombers were built by the Great Lakes Aircraft Company, which split off from Martin during these years, and these virtually identical planes were designated TG. Development work on the T-4M produced upgraded prototypes for successor designs during the 1930s, but these were not developed into service aircraft. Therefore, the T-4M and the TG remained in service until 1938, when they began to be replaced by the monoplane TBD Devastator. As we have noted in our series on the SBD Dauntless, the U.S. Navy performed a great deal of the pioneering work in the technique of dive bombing during the interwar decades. Due to its high degree of precision, this form of attack offered a practical method of attacking heavily armored, maneuvering enemy warships with the aircraft and weapons available to the Navy at the time. Initially, this was carried out using modified versions of the biplane fighters in use at the time, specifically the Curtiss F-6C Hawks. Specialized dive bombers were subsequently built, such as the Martin BM series biplanes of the early 1930s. Development work soon led to the first American monoplane dive bombers, the Northrop BT series. These appeared in 1936, and would eventually be developed into the highly successful Douglas SBD Dauntless, early models of which began to enter service in 1940. Another 2-seater monoplane entered service with the dive bomber squadrons beginning in 1937. This was the Vought SB-2U Vindicator, a rugged but somewhat underpowered aircraft that would still be frontline equipment for the Marines and the Navy at the time of Pearl Harbor. The BT and later the Vindicator served alongside the last military biplane used by any of the U.S. Armed Services, the Curtiss SBC Helldiver. This fast and maneuverable machine entered service in 1938. Some remained in service with the carriers of the U.S. Atlantic Fleet in the first months of the Second World War. Pure scout and patrol planes were also undergoing a similar evolution, both those launched from ships' catapults and the larger flying boats. Most relevant to the story of the F-2A Buffalo, however, is the growth and development of Navy fighter aviation. The successive biplane Navy fighters that followed the Vought Bluebirds in the TS series are incremental improvements of preceding designs, with incrementally increased performance. Improvements in aircraft and engine design were incorporated as they became practical, and the draggy wood and canvas aircraft were replaced by more streamlined machines made from light metal alloys. 3 series of naval fighters were developed in the interwar period, each by a different manufacturer. The first was produced by Curtiss, one of the very first aircraft makers in the United States and one that had already produced numerous types of floatplanes and flying boats for the Navy. The TS fighter mentioned before was a kind of joint venture of Curtiss and the Naval Aircraft Factory, and it can be seen as the beginning of a line of Curtiss Navy fighters, specifically with the all-metal version of the TS, the F-4C. The F-6C, introduced in 1925, begins a series of Navy fighters adapted from the Hawk series used by the Army. This series includes the F-6C, the F-7C, the F-9C, and the F-11C. It runs through to the early 1930s. These planes are mostly incremental upgrades of a single-seat radial engine biplane, capable of between 155 and 200 miles per hour, or 250 and 320 kph, and armed with a pair of 30 caliber machine guns. These were more or less identical to the Army's P-1s, P-6s, and P-12s. The F-9C Sparrowhawk was a specialized variant, a unique parasite fighter that was designed to operate from the Navy's airships. The Sparrowhawk was equipped with a hook projecting from the center section of the upper wing, which engaged a trapeze-like structure on the airship, enabling the fighter to attach itself to the dirigible and to be hoisted aboard during flight. A second series of interwar Navy fighters was produced by a company which is more often associated with large transport and bomber aircraft, namely Boeing. This manufacturer's first successful design had been a seaplane, the Model C, adopted by the Navy as a trainer in 1917, after the entry of the U.S. into the First World War. Boeing PW-8 was the rival of the first Curtiss Hawks, and in the end both of these designs were selected for development in the early 1920s. In the Army, this would result in the PW series of fighters and their radial engine successors, the P-12s. In the Navy, the design was developed as the FB series and included the FB, the F-2B, the F-3B, and the F-4B. These were broadly similar to the Curtiss Hawks, single-seat, open cockpit, fixed-gear biplanes with radial engines. In comparison to the Hawks, the Boeings were smaller and more heavily armed, with a gun armament of 150 caliber and 1 or 2 30 caliber machine guns. The Boeings were also normally fitted to carry a small number of light bombs. A third series of naval fighters began with the early 30s. These were produced by Grumman, a company whose name would become synonymous with U.S. Navy fighter aviation. This company had been started in 1929 by Leroy Grumman, a former engineer for the Leaning Aircraft Engineering Corporation, which had made flying boats for the Navy. Grumman and his partners began their own firm after Leaning was bought by the Keystone Aircraft Corporation, and operations moved from New York to Pennsylvania. The new enterprise did metalworking for the automotive industry until it managed to land a Navy contract. This was the result of their pioneering work in retractable landing gear, beginning with retractable floats for seaplanes. The first Grumman aircraft also introduced retractable landing gear, with the wheels tucking up into a recess under the nose just behind the engine, in the manner seen on later Grumman fighters up to the Wildcat. This aircraft was a 2-seater biplane called the FF, known to its crews as the Fifi. It first flew in 1931 and began to enter service in 1933. The plane still had numerous struts and wires bracing the wings and tail surfaces, but the fuselage had a more modern, streamlined form, and the 700 horsepower Wright Cyclone engine was fared over with a cowling ring. Combined with the retractable undercarriage, this gave the Fifi a top speed of more than 200 miles per hour, or 320 kph, considerably faster than the latest Curtiss or Boeing fighters. Depending on the specific model, it was armed with a pair of 30 caliber or a 50 caliber and a 30 caliber machine guns firing forward. Another 30 caliber in the rear cockpit operated by the second crewman. Attachment points for a pair of light bombs were also included under the wings. The superior speed of the Grumman fighter resulted in further development contracts. The next in the series, the F-2F, began to enter service in 1935. This was a single-seater, armed with a pair of 30 calibers and powered by a Pratt & Whitney twin Wasp. The F-2F was capable of 230 miles per hour, or 370 kph, and featured a sleeker fuselage shape and more streamlined cowling design. It It also proved handier and capable of more radical maneuvers than its predecessor. The last Grumman biplane fighter, indeed the last biplane fighter built for any branch of the American armed forces, was the next in the series, the F-3F. This was a development of the F-2F. The wheels of the landing gear were made smaller, allowing a more streamlined shape to the fuselage, which resembles a Seversky P-35 or a shortened P-47 Thunderbolt. The fuselage was lengthened and the wings enlarged compared to the F-2F. The final model, the F-3F3, used a 950 horsepower Wright Cyclone 9-cylinder radial and could reach a speed of 265 miles per hour, or 425 kph. The F-3F returned to the mixed armament of the original FF and carried one 50 caliber and one 30 caliber machine gun, as well as provision for a pair of light bombs suspended beneath the wings. The last F-3F3s were ordered in late June of 1938. This was later than had been planned, as the F-3F2 models built earlier that year had been intended to be followed by a new generation of monoplane Navy fighters. The development of these advanced fighters, however, had taken somewhat longer than anticipated, and the 27 planes on the June order were procured to fill squadron needs and to provide replacements for older aircraft until the new fighters under development could reach production status. This process, however, was already well underway, and the first of the new generation of Navy fighters was already flying in prototype form before the last F-3F3s were even on the assembly line. And that is where I will end this video. Next time, we'll look at the prototypes built to replace the Navy's biplane fighters, and the development and entry into service of the Buffalo. Till then, I remain Mark 7, wishing you all the best.